15.
I'm the only investigative journalist who's intentionally funny, but Donald McIntyre is unintentionally funny. Anyway, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my new book, The Psychopath Test. It started when I was at a friend's house and she had on her shelf the DSM. Do people know the DSM manual? Yeah, it's the Manual of Mental Disorders. And it used to be very thin. In the 1950s, it was like kind of 15 pages. And now it's 886 pages. So in the last 30 years, they've discovered a whole load of mental disorders. So I was kind of leafing through it, wondering if I had any mental disorders. And I diagnosed myself with 12. I've got generalized anxiety disorder. I've got nightmare disorder, which is categorized when you have recurrent dreams of either being pursued or declared a failure. And all my dreams involve somebody chasing me down the street yelling, "You're a failure!" I've got malingering. And I think it's actually quite rare to have malingering and generalized anxiety disorder, because malingering tends to make me feel very anxious. So this seemed odd to me. I didn't know whether I was much crazier than I thought I was, or maybe it's not a good idea to self-diagnose if you're not a trained professional, or maybe the psychiatry industry has a kind of fetish to diagnose essentially normal behavior as a mental disorder. So those are the questions I was asking myself as I was leafing through this book. Much later, by the way, I met the person who edited the DSM-3, and he told me how they invented a whole load of mental disorders. Basically, he had an office at Columbia, and he'd bring in all these people, and he'd say, "Anyone got any ideas?" And somebody in the back would shout, "How about ADHD?" And he'd say, "Well, okay, what of its overt characteristics?" And he'd kind of yell them out, and he'd be on a typewriter. And that's kind of how manic depression and bulimia and ADHD all came to be, in these kind of chaotic sessions. His name's Robert Spitzer. I asked him if there were any mental disorders that he rejected, and he thought for a minute, and he said, "Yeah, there was one. We rejected atypical child syndrome." And he said, the problem is that when I asked the man proposing it what the overt characteristics were, he said, that's very hard to say because the children are very atypical. Anyway, I thought this is very strange, and I thought it'd be kind of interesting to meet a critic of psychiatry to get their view on that. So I ended up having lunch with the Scientologists, who have a crack team of psychiatry busters who've dedicated their lives to destroying the industry of psychiatry. So I said, "Can you prove to me that psychiatry is a pseudoscience?" And he said, "Yeah, I can, by introducing you to Tony." And I said, "Who's Tony?" And he said, "Tony's in Broadmoor." So I said, "Okay." He said, "Yeah, he faked madness to get out a prison sentence, faked it a bit too well, and now he's stuck. And the more he tries to convince the people at Broadmoor he's sane, the more they take it as evidence that he's crazy. Do you want us to get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony?" So I said, "Yes, please." So I went to Broadmoor with Brian, the Scientologist, and I don't know, has anyone here ever sort of been as a visitor or patient? It's basically it looks like a giant travelling. It's all peach and pink, and the air conditioning is like a constant sigh. It's like, and the only bold colours are the reds of the panic buttons. And we went to the wellness centre. Brian said to me, "You know, Tony's the only patient in the entire DSPD unit to have the privilege of meeting people in the wellness centre." And I said, "What does DSPD stand for?" And he said, "Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder." So I said, "What, is Tony in the part of Broadmoor that houses the most dangerous people?" And he said, "Yeah, crazy, isn't it?" So the patients started drifting in, and they're all quite overweight, wearing sweatpants and docile, and Brian, the Scientologist, whispered to me, they're medicated, which to the Scientologist is like the worst evil in the world, but I'm thinking, well, that's probably a good idea. And then Brian said, okay, there's Tony. And Tony had come in, and he wasn't overweight, and he wasn't wearing sweatpants. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, and he was walking towards me with his arm outstretched, like somebody wanted to convince me that he was very sane. He looked like someone out of The Apprentice. He looked like Jim out of The Apprentice. So he sat down, and I said, so is it true that you faked your way in here? He said, yeah, I beat someone up in Reading Town Centre when I was 17. I was on remand, and my cellmate said, you're looking at 5 years. Fake madness. It's easy. Just tell him you're mad. They'll put you in some cushy hospital. Nurses will bring you pizzas. You'll have a PlayStation. I said, so how did you do it? He said, well, I'd just seen this David Cronenberg movie called Crash, where people derive sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. So I told the prison psychiatrist that I get sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. And I said, what else? And he said, I told the psychiatrist that I liked to watch women as they died because it made me feel normal. And I said, where did you get that from? He said, from a biography of Ted Bundy that they had in the prison library. Anyway, he faked madness much too well. And they sent him straight to Broadmoor. The minute he got there, he took one look at the place and asked to see a psychiatrist and said, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I said, how long have you been in Broadmoor for? He said, well, if I'd just done my time, I'd have done 5 years. I've been in Broadmoor for 12 years. He said, it's much harder to convince people you're sane than it is to convince them you're mad. He said his first plan of action was to just mention articles he'd read in magazines, because that's a sane thing to do, right? So he said he subscribed to New Scientist, and for instance, recently they had an article about how the US Army was training bumblebees to sniff out explosives. So he said to a nurse, oh, did you know that the US Army's training bumblebees to sniff out explosives? And later when he read his notes, they'd written, believes bees can sniff out explosives. And it's quite lucky that I didn't meet any psychiatrists when I was writing The Many Hysteric Goats, which is all about that. It's about how the US Army had a team of special forces soldiers called Project Jedi, and I met one of them in Hawaii. And he said it was a series of levels. And I said, what's level 1? He said, level 1 is observation. You walk into a room, how many chairs are in the room? He said, a super soldier would just know. And I said, what's level 2? He said, level 2, intuition. You have a fork in the road, you go left, you go right, you go right. And I said, what's level 3? He said, invisibility. I said, that's quite a leap from... I said, what, actual invisibility? He said, well, at first. But after a while, we adapted it to just trying to find a way of not being seen. I said, like, camouflage. And he went, no. I said, what was level 4? He said, level 4 was we had a master sergeant that could stop the heart of a goat just by wanting it to stop. And I said, did you ever manage it? And he said, well, we did once, but the man doing the staring, his heart got damaged. And I said, what was the goat psychically fighting back? He said, the goat didn't stand a chance. Apparently one time they had, I realise this is a digression, at one point they had 30 goats in a room and they were labelled 1 to 30 and they were all staring at goat number 16 and goat number 17 apparently fell over, which I guess is collateral damage. Okay, so that's what Tony tried to do to try and seem sane, but it didn't work. He said everything he does is evidence that he's crazy, and it's very difficult. You know, how do you sit in a sane way? How do you cross your legs in a sane way? He said he doesn't like really hanging around with the other patients because he finds them quite frightening, like the Stockwell Strangler, so he stays in his room a lot. And they take that as evidence that he's crazy because it shows he's grandiose and aloof So only in Broadmoor would not wanting to hang out with serial killers be considered a sign of madness. So Tony seemed very sane, but I didn't know what to think. I left, and then I wrote to his clinician, and I said, well, what's the story? And his clinician, Anthony Maiden, wrote back and said, we accept his story. We accept that he faked mental illness to get out of a prison sentence, because the minute he got here, his delusions just vanished. Excuse me. However, we've assessed him, and we've decided that he's a psychopath. And in fact, faking your brain going wrong is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. That's item 7 on the checklist, cunning, manipulative. He said the pinstripe suit, that's classic psychopath. As item 1 and 2 on the checklist, glibness, superficial charm, and grandiose sense of self-worth. Not wanting to hang out with the other patients, that's lack of empathy, and also grandiose sense of self-worth. So all the things that seemed sane about Tony was evidence that he was mad in this different way. And he said, if you want to know more, you can actually do a psychopath spotting course for £600 with Robert Hare, who invented the checklist. So I did the course, and I became a qualified and extremely adept psychopath spotter. The statistic is this: 1 in 100 regular walking around people are psychopaths. So how many people are in this room? Probably, what, about 200? So there's probably about 200 psychopaths in here. Or more if psychopaths enjoy going to talks about psychopaths. 4% of corporate professionals are psychopaths. Apparently, you're 4 times more likely to have one leading you than you are to have one as your subordinate. And this is quite, I mean, it's hard to tell in the dark, but it seems like quite a fancy crowd. So it is possible that there's a preponderance of psychopaths in the room. Anyway, so I did the course, and I immediately started spotting psychopaths everywhere. I diagnosed... I decided to go back into my past to think of people who'd crossed me, to see who I could out as a psychopath. So I identified A.A. Gill as a psychopath. Because he shot a baboon on safari to know what it would be like to kill a person. He always gives me very bad reviews. And yesterday, in the Sunday Times, he said that the Killing Fields documentary suffered from too much empathy. That's classic psychopath. That was just yesterday. Sing it from the rooftops. A.A. Gill is definitely a psychopath. I hedged my bets in the book. I said that he had psychopathic traits, but I'm willing to go all the way. Classic psychopath. The other person I identified as a classic psychopath was a Haitian death squad leader I'd met 15 years ago called Toto Constant, who, like Tony and like A.A. Gill, wore a nice suit when I met him. He'd got away with his crimes because he was secretly working for the CIA at the same time, so they allowed him to move in with his mother in Queens, but he was never allowed to go into Manhattan, so he'd stand in Queens and stare at the... I can't believe I've only got 2 minutes left. I've got so many more stories. Stare at the Chrysler Building. I went to see it anyway. It turns out I'd met him 15 years earlier, and he pretended to cry during the interview with me, which seemed very shallow affect, an inability to feel a deep range of emotions. So I went to see him at his prison in upstate New York, where he basically said, I really want people to like me. It's very, very important to me that people like me. I feel... And I was thinking, God, I've wasted my time. I've driven all those 6 hours, and he just wants people to like him. This is ridiculous. A complete waste of my day, which I suppose is slightly lack of empathy. And I said, isn't that a weakness to desperately want people to like you? He said, no, it's not a weakness, because if you can get people to like you, you can manipulate them to do whatever you want them to do. Anyway, then I met a CEO called Al Dunlap, who was America's most remorseless CEO in the 1990s. He would always fire people with a quip. Somebody would say to him, I've just bought a new car. And he'd say, I'll tell you what, you've got a car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job. So I went to see him at his mansion, his Florida mansion. He was responsible for closing down towns across the American South. Anyway, his mansion is filled with sculptures of predatory animals. Anyway, I said to him, can I do the psychopath test on you? And he said, okay, after initial disappointment and anger, he said, okay. And sure enough, he redefined pretty much every item on the psychopath checklist as a business positive. He kind of turned the psychopath checklist into who moved my cheese. It's a grandiose sense of self-worth, which would have been difficult for him to deny because he was standing underneath a giant oil painting of himself at the time. He said, well, you've got to believe in you. He said, lack of remorse. Who wants to be weighed down by remorse? And so on. I got really worried as I left his house, actually. I thought he got involved in a terrible accountancy fraud. And as I left his house, I thought I was like a genius. I'd cracked him open with my psychopath spotting abilities. And then I got really panicky that, you know, he was going to like read the book and get someone to come after me. So I pulled in like nervously to this drive-in Starbucks and went through my notes, and I got to the part where he said that since the accountancy fraud, you know, everyone's abandoned him and he's all alone in the world. And I thought, oh, well, that's okay. But I'm not a psychopath. In fact, I'm the neurological opposite of a psychopath. Eleanor, is that it? I think on this note, just to kind of reassure you all that I'm not a psychopath, and in fact have, if anything, a surfeit of empathy, which makes me especially nice. I want to say thank you very much.